Welcome to RSP Film and Theory. Adam Harstad and Matt Waldman. This week we do have things we're going to be talking about other than writing and the craft and all of that, but we did appreciate the feedback that you guys did provide. Certainly it was interesting. I know that you've had some, Adam. I had one from a surgeon who basically said that there were a lot of things that were eerily very close to home with what they did for a profession, even though we were talking about our area of our industry. It seemed like that was a theme I heard repeatedly with that. But today, we're gonna talk a little bit about Brock Bowers and how what we think about him within the scope of other tight ends who got off to great starts and had great production throughout their careers. We're going to look at Adam's Dynasty and Theory article on the concept of many leagues in one team. And we're going to talk about quarterback development and the film world's desire at times to err on the hyper analysis or micro analysis of things that may not really link to what's going to develop into that's going to dictate good or bad development. And I think it's a little bit soap opera-esque. So let's start off with Brock Bowers, because that's the fun one. You were talking about, Adam, that on your timeline that you've had a lot of people asking about his skills in the scope of like the history of the tight end position. And so, why don't you start and we'll go from there.
The big question I got is Brock Bowers having the best season by a rookie tight end in NFL history? That's easy to shoot down. No, he's not. The best season by a rookie tight end in NFL history was Mike Ditka back in 1961. Ditka had 1,076 yards and 12 touchdowns in a 14-game season. Ditka wasn't really the first receiving tight end. Detroit had been kind of experimenting with the role for a year or two, but he was really the tight end that put the position on the map. Like back in the early 60s, there was no all-pro for the tight end position. And then by, I think, 63, that had changed. And suddenly there was. It was like this entire position had been created in a 5-year span. And Ditka was a large part of that. So just in terms of like production, nobody's ever come anywhere close to him. Just in terms of impact on the league and like the way that he changed the way that games were played, nobody will ever come close to him. And I say that, very thoughtfully, because I know that lots of unexpected stuff is going to happen. I just you can't create a new position like that anymore. That's just not the way the NFL works, because it's much more established and it's much more, polished and proven at this point. So no, Brock Bowers is not the best rookie tight end in history. In my opinion, he's not really particularly close. I do have some other names that I think he's kind of in the conversation with for like second best rookie tight end in history. And like some names I throw out would be Jeremy Shockey and Keith Jackson were both first team AP All-Pros as rookies. I believe they're the only two who have ever done that, especially because, like I said, there wasn't an All-Pro tight end when Ditka was a rookie in the first place. So I think Shockey and Jackson, guys like Gronk and Hernandez did not have the raw numbers of a Bowers, but just in terms of like their impact on that offense. Tom Brady was, I believe that was his first unanimous MVP season. I mean, it definitely wasn't 2007 because I think Favre stole a vote that year. But that was Brady's unanimous MVP season with basically nothing in terms of what people thought about his receiving core. It was very lightly regarded receiving core. Wes Welker was coming off an injury, and he was kind of a shell of his former self. They traded for Deion Branch at midseason, but Gronk and Hernandez and that two tight end set really elevated and carried that offense. And then another guy who I think is a really interesting comparison to Bowers would be Jordan Reed from Washington back in 2013. Like if you just look at Bowers' numbers to date and Jordan Reed's numbers for the entire season, because Reed missed so much time, and especially if you take into account the fact that Reed left 2 games early with injury and kind of ramped up slowly at the beginning of the year, they're pretty much identical, like production-wise. And then, of course, you have Laporta last year and Pitts a couple years ago also in the conversation. So people were asking me, and I gave my thoughts on it. To me, I don't think Bowers is quite on the level of Jackson and Shockey yet. And I think him and Reed are pretty comparable. Bowers will probably pass him at some point in the next few weeks just because he's going to stay on the field, hopefully. But I also recognize one of the flaws with my process is, since I'm only looking at outcomes, I kind of need a large amount of data to draw inferences and to form these opinions. So I was kind of curious what your thoughts on it were, since you're able to actually watch the film and evaluate the players based on their processes. And so I'm sure you'd have some more informed opinions on some of these names than I would.
Yeah, I mean, I love the names that you threw out there in range, and I agree with you that Ditka was the best of all time in the amount of games that he did it. Also, the style of play that he had. He was a great combination of speed and strength and contact balance, as well as having the grace and route running skill to earn separation and win the football. Now,
And a devastating blocker, which he really had to be in the 60s, in a way that modern tight ends, they don't need that aspect of the game. We talked about TJ Hawkinson last year and how the position is almost impossible because it's asking so many different things, but Ditka did all of the different aspects.
yeah, without a doubt. I would say, obviously we talked about how, Gronkowski was that unicorn, for sure. But I would also argue, and it's not going to be a popular one because people think of, again, they can't compartmentalize. But if we were to compartmentalize Aaron Hernandez, I would say he was maybe the most talented all-around tight end I've ever watched, because of the ability because within his physical dimensions, his strength was unbelievable. And so he could block in line, not as well as Gronkowski, but better than you would expect. He was a running back in mentality and in ability. He conceptually could play running back, but he was also a downfield receiver with, I would argue, a much better route runner than Gronkowski even was, and even better after the catch. But he just, he was a troubled human being.
And even beyond that, I mean, he struggled to stay on the field, and that matters when you're talking about.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that Hernandez is the closest we've seen to Kellen Winslow Sr.
Yeah. And so for me, when I look at a guy like Brock Bowers, I don't think he's ever going to reach Aaron Hernandez talent levels in terms of development. But I think he's closer to that than a lot of the guys that I have seen come through. And when you look at, I think Bowers is never going to be a great inline blocker, but he'll be better than, say, Laporta. I think he has better technique than Laporta does in certain regards. He's someone that I think has a little bit more strength, and he's more dynamic than Laporta as a receiver. Separation, ability to go up and win the ball. He's maybe not as, I don't know if he's as good of, I think Laporta's a better one-on-one route runner, but it's not so far of a distance between them that Bowers doesn't make up for it in terms of catch point and after the catch and some of the blocking that he does. Keith Jackson's not a bad option to kind of compare him to in some regards. I think that I don't think Jackson was all that great of a blocker. Shockey was a pretty good blocker. And Shockey's injuries were kind of a problematic thing too. And Shockey was a little bit more of a maniac on the field in terms of, wanting to run people over and be physical to his detriment. Whereas I think Jackson was a little more of a finesse player and a great finesse player. And I think Bowers leans more towards the finesse, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way about either one of them. It's just more on that spectrum. Jordan Reed's a great comp. I think that's probably the best one because Reed bulked up and could just pass as a tight end when he got into the league, but he had that grace and speed and the ability to win the football and earn separation off the line, that you saw him as more of an H-back, a true H-back. And I think that that's really what Bowers is. So, yeah, I like that comparison best of them. But I thought I'd walk us through, kind of the compare and contrast with everybody.
Yeah, I think to me the most interesting one is Bowers versus Shockey, because if you look just statistically, Bowers is probably ahead. Now Shockey came along like kind of right when I was getting into watching football, so I'm kind of curious to get the opinion of an old person on this. But my general impression of Shockey is that he was just feared in a way that like most other tight ends aren't. Like even at the time, you had Gonzalez, you had Sharp. So this idea of a receiving tight end wasn't novel. But the general impression was that Gonzalez and Sharp were counter punches. Those teams had their main punch, and then when you were overcommitting to that main punch, Gonzalez and Sharp would punish you. Whereas I felt more in New York that Shockey was the punch, and then like Amani Toomer was the counterpunch. And I know that Amani Toomer had more catches and targets and yards and everything, but just in terms of like, Shockey felt like the guy that defenses feared and were game planning for, who was opening up stuff for everyone else in a way that, especially in 2002, was it? It was very novel. Tight ends, you hadn't really seen that from the position, or that was kind of not in a while. Not since the mid to late '80s, when you had Winslow and Christensen, and even to some extent like Mark Bavaro. So yeah, to me, Shockey. I mean, I know the statistics, and I'm typically the statistics guy, and I bet if I dig into the statistics, maybe Bowers comes out a little bit ahead. I might be giving into narrative. I might be giving into everybody thinks that the era of football where they got into football, that was the best and purest form of the game ever played. And,
Right.
and I might have some of that bias going on here. But I look, and then also too, you look at like the ancillary indicators, which I wouldn't base the entire argument off of this, but like Kerry Collins had the best season of his career by like a full standard deviation over any other season in his career that year. And it's not like Kerry Collins only played 5 years. He had 12, 13-year career. And this one just stood head and shoulders above all of the others. And you can't attribute all of that to Shockey, but I have to think he played some non-trivial role. So yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on who you think is the better rookie tight end, given the context and given everything else surrounding them.
Well, I mean, I think for one, what's kind of clouded by it is that Kerry Collins was, while never a great quarterback, he was a competent quarterback. And had developed into a competent, pretty good quarterback in New York. And there were more weapons. They had Tiki Barber and a good run game and a solid offensive line, and they played disciplined football under Tom Coughlin. And like you said, Amani Toomer was a decent deep threat and had kind of grown into the role. Whereas the Raiders are a mess kind of right now. I mean, they got rid of Adams, and if Adams was still there, I would feel a little bit better about maybe being able to judge them 1-to-1. But right now, it's Brock Bowers is just getting schemed a lot of throws in ways that aren't necessarily one-on-one matchups. They're just like they're almost, I don't want to call them cheap catches, but they're more easy, like plays that don't do a lot of damage unless he breaks tackles and gets into the open field. Like, he's got to be Ditka to make a Ditka-like impact, or to make the type of impact to put him in comparison with Shockey, because they're using him as an extension of the run game more often than they're using him as a downfield option, at least in recent weeks without Devontae Adams there. So I would probably be inclined to agree with you that Shockey was more valuable in that early time. But from a fantasy perspective, Bowers is going to eclipse that, I think.
Oh yeah, especially
with
points per reception, like no question.
Yeah.
I get it. Kind of gets to, this isn't really fair. Like, it's not Bowers' fault that the Raiders are kind of a dumpster fire. That's not. People ask, like, what else could he do? Well, there's really nothing else he can do. He can't make that team functional on his own. But with that said, the goal isn't to be fair. The goal is to be accurate. And the reality is, we've seen good players. Like, if you're a good enough player, if you're over some certain skill threshold where you're able to separate and you're able to get open and you're able to make an impact even with the extra defensive attention. Once you're over that threshold, it's just hard to evaluate you when you're the only good player
Yeah.
on the unit, because you're going to get a lot of stuff just by dint of the fact that you're the only good player on the entire unit. I mean, we've seen it with a lot of people, and again, it's not fair. There's nothing Bowers could do, but my general impression is it's harder to have a tangible impact on a unit that has a lot of other good players. It's harder to stand out and say, like, this guy's the most dangerous player, this guy's the guy that's driving the improvement, than it is when, I mean, you look at like Rob Moore in Arizona. Rob Moore was a very good receiver. Not like a great one, but he was a very good receiver. But he's the only guy on those teams, and he's getting like 200 targets a year, and he's putting up big numbers because screw it, who else is Arizona going to throw to? Or you look at like Anquan Bolden sets his career high receiving yards his rookie year because there's nobody else on the team, but he was a better player with Larry Fitzgerald there.
Yeah. And then, I mean, I think part of it too is you have to have quality quarterback play. And I'm not sure, you know, I think Gardner Minshew is right on the Mason-Dixon line between good and bad. You know, and I think that that's part of the problem. If he were Patrick Mahomes on a DeAndre Hopkins list Chiefs, which by the way I think is just an excellent trade. I know that Hopkins isn't what he used to be probably, but he's still got more than enough left. That was a steal. It was probably the only place that he could go that would be a great fit. But if say they needed a central casting, said let's just take Travis Kelce out of the equation and put Brock Bowers in, and had a full training camp to get up to speed, I would argue that Brock Bowers would be more valuable than Travis Kelce right now on that team, in terms of the function of how he could be used, what he would do, how he could adjust with Mahomes and the types of plays that he could make. And you can kind of look at it with my colleague Felix Sharp was talking about Georgia's Carson Beck and how he went from being this really strong prospect last year because he had McConkey and Bowers to throw to, going back to now he's back at the old Georgia style of football, which is play lights out defense and run the football, and you don't have much else, you know, going for you in the receiving game, you know. And I think that's the tough part about passing, is that it is always a partnership. So, you know, there's about 4 or 5 teams I could see Bowers being on and saying maybe he could make that argument that we want to see him make that we're not going to see in Las Vegas, you know. And it's just tough because like you talk about injuries too. You know, the one player that I think about all the time, who another kind of tragic figure in the sport, which also maybe in an odd way suggests how hard this position really is on the human body, and also how football can be hard on the head, is Kellen Winslow Jr. Because Kellen Winslow Jr. could have been as good as he was. So when he came back from that,
he could have been better than his dad for sure.
Yeah.
He had the tools and the potential.
Yeah, that bike accident that he had, the fact that he even came back from it and had a good season, just tells, it's kind of like that's almost as better, you know, in some ways it's on par with talking about how good Frank Gore was with 2 ACL tears. You know, this guy could have been one of the best ever, if not the best ever, at that position, and he ruined it. You know, with that bike accident and playing, you know, being reckless and all of that. And he also had a tragic life, I would say, in terms of how he took the direction that he chose to be in. But again, talent-wise, that's another one that you look at and say, probably, if I'm just looking from talent, not results, he would belong high on that list too.
Agreed. Yeah, and especially even beyond talent, potential, which often is a dirty word, and I think that gets thrown around way too much. But that doesn't mean there's no place for it in analysis. Yeah, I mean, I think aesthetically, and I guess this is largely an aesthetic choice on my part, but when I'm evaluating players and how good they are, I think my preferred lens is how many doors is this player opening for you that might otherwise be closed? Like, what is this player allowing you to do? What avenues are now available to you that might otherwise not be available to you? And I just feel like Jeremy Shockey opened more doors for the 2002 New York Giants than Brock Bowers is for the 2024 Las Vegas Raiders.
Yeah.
Fair or not? That's
Yeah.
kind of where I land on that.
Yeah.
So
I think it's a little unfair, but I understand the point of view.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it like I said, I think it's an aesthetic preference. It's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think Bowers is better than Laporta and Pitts, especially like over the first half of their rookie seasons. I would take him over them. He's obviously not touching Ditka. Like nobody's gonna come close to Ditka probably ever. And then after that, I would say probably third best so far, third best rookie season in history, or trending towards the third. Because like I said, right now I think him and Jordan Reed are basically the same guy. But trending towards the third best rookie season in history behind Ditka and Shockey, with the caveat that like I didn't really see Keith Jackson play, and obviously I didn't see Ditka play either. But I've gone back and I've studied Ditka a lot more than I've studied Keith Jackson. So maybe I'm underrating Keith Jackson. I kind of feel like his All-Pro award was as much reflection of him as a player, great player, but also a reflection of the trend in the position as a whole, which after Winslow and Christensen and Bavaro was just in a probably a decade-long slump until Sharp and Gonzo broke him out of it.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating to look at. I think one of the things that is important to note, and because it kind of breaks off into another topic a little bit, but I think we underrate how important. I mean, we talk about landing spot all the time and how important landing spot is, but in a different way, like confidence level. I think that you look at Kyle Pitts, and I think if you took I have a theory that if you took Kyle Pitts and put him on the 49ers in his rookie year, and he had a structure, he had a clear path in terms of what was expected of him, and he was held accountable for that path.
Got the feedback. I mean, yeah. I don't think he got a lot of feedback between quality of play and that directed feedback, which is so crucial.
And just continuity across other positions. I think that he could have been a superstar early. Or Kansas City, or somewhere where it's a stable organization. Pittsburgh, well, Pittsburgh didn't have a stable quarterback, but you know what I'm saying, like an organization with a stable quarterback and a stable offensive mind. And what he ended up on was a mishmash of coordinators and quarterbacks who were bad. And when your quarterbacks are bad, when you have teammates who aren't playing up to snuff, you start to overcompensate. It's like being in a dysfunctional family. If you come from a dysfunctional family, you understand this very clearly, is that you in order for you to cope, you start trying to anticipate what other people need, because you realize that in order for you to emotionally or physically survive, you have to anticipate what other people are thinking or feeling, or what they might think or feel, to a level that you put that before your own role. And then when you get out into the world and you start trying to have relationships with people where you would function whatever normally is and what ideally is, you start to realize that you're over anticipating other people's needs. You're trying to either people please, or you're behaving in a way where your trauma and how you've survived in that childhood environment interferes how you're surviving in your adult environment, and you have to untie those knots and relearn that stuff. Well, I think the same thing happens on a certain level with teams, because teams are like a family in some sense, and there's a level of communication and a level of expectation. And whether you're a quarterback or you're a wide receiver, sometimes you find yourself overthinking things if you wind up in these dysfunctional environments, and you can't separate what your role is from what their role should be, and you haven't ever experienced how the role should actually be played out. And I've heard musicians talk about this too, is like the whole Brock Purdy argument I've made in the past, is that I've had some musicians. There's a guy from Los Lobos who's a saxophone player I got to talk with last year, and he brought up the idea that in some ways, when you play with great musicians, you level up faster because you don't have to think about compensating for what they did. You just have to focus on yourself, and everything is so good, and because they do things well, they make your job easier, and there's a better interplay and flow. And this is exactly what I think a guy like Kyle Pitts was missing from that. And now you're just living year to year trying to figure out what's the right way about going about things. And that's why I think some people have career renaissances, because they were always talented, but they finally found an environment where it actually all clicks, and they're allowed to level up faster, and they could get rid of some of the baggage that came with that early on career part. And I think Brock Bowers is probably, he's not in a place where I think they've done damage to him, but I think they're in a place where they're just giving him extensions of the run game and things like that. And if they end up with like Aiden O'Connell as the permanent starter, and O'Connell doesn't develop, and then they get another rookie, and then they get a new coordinator, and they fire another coach, he could wind up in that kind of spin cycle that eventually be a little bit damaged, where he's good, but he's never quite ever what he could have maximally been.
Yeah, I mean, I think bringing it back to last week and developing craft, I feel like any craft, to develop it and to really get good at it, you really need two things. Is when you do poorly, you need to know that you did poorly, and when you did well, you need to know that you did well. You need that feedback. And I think that if you're the only good player on a team, quite often you can find yourself in a position where whatever you do, you're told you did well, right? Like you can't do any wrong. Or because of expectations, you're in a position where you can't do any wrong, and that's damaging. Or I think it's just as easy, if you have a coach who's a little bit too trust-based, but unwilling to extend that trust and to give people a chance to earn that trust, you can find yourself in a position where you can't do anything right. And I think that's damaging as well. You look at Sam Darnold, and I would say in New York, when he first got there, he was in that position where, he's the golden boy, he's the savior of the franchise, he can't do anything wrong. And then after he washed out in the Jets, he starts going elsewhere in the league, and now he's in this position where he's a bust. He can't do anything right. And maybe that was the secret in Minnesota, is they just said, if you do poorly, we're going to tell you. If you do well, we're going to tell you. We have these standards and expectations, and we don't care who you were before. If you meet those expectations, you'll be rewarded. And if you don't meet those expectations, then we're going to push you to meet those expectations. We're not ever going to settle for anything less than what we can get out of you. I think that's a big difference between functional organizations and dysfunctional organizations. You hear Mike Tomlin talk about the craft of coaching, and that's a lot of what he says. He talks about how, like, if the player's struggling, it's not the player struggling, it's your coaching that's struggling. That's your job to get the best out of people and to give them that feedback. I'm not super worried about Brock Bowers long term, because I do think talented players do tend to find their level. But it's important. I agree with Kyle. There's a lot of path dependency, and careers can really hinge on just the kind of, not even the situation like how good the players around you are, but just the situation in terms of just what kind of institutional support you're getting, whether it's too much, too little, or just a healthy amount.
Yeah, I think we're splitting between good and great with all these players, not so much whether good or no good. Excuse me. Right. So I think there's part of that. I would also say I love what you brought up with Tomlin, because also good coaches and good systems confound media sometimes. Like, I overheard Chris Collinsworth this weekend talking about Russell Wilson and the whole situation with Justin Fields, and you could tell that, I'm going to editorialize and guess, and I'm probably wrong, or he would deny it even if I were right, which would be me saying Chris Collinsworth was actively trying to create drama on television by saying, well, Justin Fields would have kept running on this particular play if Russell Wilson, where Russell Wilson just took this 5-yard play. And I asked Mike Tomlin about what he was doing with this whole quarterback situation, and he said, well, we're trying to find out what's going on. And, and I asked him another direct kind of pointed question. I don't remember how he phrased it. And he said, I don't know yet. And he goes, so I don't really think Tomlin really even knows what he's doing. And that was just a bullshit answer, okay? I mean, like, that was a doofus kind of answer in a way, but it played well for TV. Because what Mike Tomlin was really saying, if you ask me, was I know what we have in Justin Fields. I don't know yet what we have in Russell Wilson, but I know what Russell Wilson has shown in the past. Let's find out, because we're in a good enough situation to do that. And I know that we're stable enough organization that I don't have to have the answer to every question, and we can find out the answer right now. And that's completely okay. And it doesn't have to be the bullshit. We have all the answers. Everything looks good. Our hair's combed straight. And we are, we're wearing the right clothes. And everything looks godlike and in control, which is what I think Chris Collinsworth is the life he's used to living. And then hiding everything underneath that. That's the bullshit that he doesn't want anybody to see, where everybody's vulnerable. And I think that a guy like Tomlin is more comfortable in, like, yeah, we don't know yet. We're in the early part of the season. We're playing winning football. We'll figure it out.
My favorite criticism of Tomlin is people are like, well, sure, he's never had a losing season because he always has great teams, right? Like, look at all the talent he's had. Like, yeah, it's just a coincidence. It's a complete coincidence that like every player Pittsburgh drafts winds up developing to their full
Kenny
potential.
Pickett was so awesome. Mason Rudolph has been just unbelievable.
Right. There's no history of Pittsburgh players going elsewhere and struggling in new environments. There's nothing to suggest that maybe Tomlin is just good at getting the most out of the players he's given. No, I'm sure he's just being given better players than everybody else in the entire NFL.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it just cracks me up. But I mean, again, there's this whole template of what the media has trained us to expect of what a good coach is supposed to be. And then that's not it. But the bias is always that way. It makes me laugh. I mean, I heard Troy Aikman at the beginning of the Ravens game talk about Lamar Jackson. And I threw up in my mouth a little bit just like listening to it, because it was like they're playing up Mike, Lamar, and you could just hear Aikman, like, and I'm thinking, Aikman, you watch NFC football all the time, which to me, in my being an asshole giving an opinion about this that really isn't true, is the worst division in football, the worst conference. AFC's way better. I'm way AFC
better.
Yeah, exactly. But Aikman, from his bias, is you could just see him go, yeah, well, he's done this and he's done this, and I'm going to give him credit for that, but he's got to win a championship. And I would say right now, Aikman was a good quarterback. He was a good quarterback. He also had one of the best offensive lines ever. He also had one of the great running backs ever. Had one of the great primary receivers who could win possession routes ever, and a terrific coach and a great defense around him. And I would argue that Lamar Jackson is a better quarterback than Troy Aikman ever was. But the standard that we award is quarterback wins in Super Bowls. And at this point, Aikman is riding that. He's made a whole career off of that. And I'm not saying he shouldn't. I'm just saying that there's a little bit of bias involved with that. So when I hear him say that, that kind of thing filters through. And part of that with Lamar, too, is that it took 7 fucking years for an actual, like, analyst on a big stage, and that was Monday night, and it was Peyton Manning, to say something that was apparent on the film at Louisville, which was, Lamar is a pocket-first quarterback. He fights to stay in the pocket before he runs. He just happens to be one of the great runners in the game, too. But he's a quarterback first, a pocket passer first. And you would think that this was like some stamp of approval revelation, but it took 7 years because of the bias that filters in a little bit with how players enter in and what the narratives result in. And I think that, that's just how it goes. And that's why we're like probably doing a niche like podcast doing this, as opposed to being on national TV where, the conversation really never advances far from the health club locker room. So.
That's true. I forgot. We're trying to get our numbers up. So let me amend my take. The Brock Bowers is the greatest, not just tight end, the greatest rookie in the history, not just of football, but of organized sport.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think I see a little bit of that red cape coming out of his black jersey there. Maybe they need to pull that out a little bit further there. They got to get on the stick. So, okay. Enough about all that. Let's get to this whole idea of many leagues, one team, and looking at all your rosters as a single group of players. So tell us about that and the benefits that you've kind of found from it.
Yeah, so a lot of times Dynasty and Theory, I'm writing stuff that okay, there's no real practical implication to any of this. I just kind of want to challenge the way that you're looking at your team, challenge the way that you're approaching the game, challenge the way that you see things. And so this was actually something that a friend of mine wrote about a decade ago that really challenged the way that I was looking at things. And the general consensus is that, okay, market value in Dynasty, it's great in theory, but there is no market, right? If I want Patrick Mahomes and I'm trying to trade for him, his market value can be whatever. Say his market value, middle third round of a startup, right? If I'm in a league where the guy absolutely loves Patrick Mahomes, if I'm playing with Patrick Mahomes' wife, I'm going to have to pay a lot more than that middle third round startup price. If I'm playing in a league where everybody hates Patrick Mahomes, let's say they're all Bengals and Bills fans, right? I could probably get him a lot cheaper. Somebody might even pay me to take him just because they're so
his wife might have had enough of him, though. She might be more interested in Josh Allen. I don't know.
Maybe. Who knows? But so market value, great in theory, but it's not like I can trade across leagues. It's not like I can trade, if I've got somebody in one league and I want to trade him for Mahomes and that's not available. It's not like I can trade across leagues and trade the player in one league to get Mahomes in another league. And that's kind of the conventional wisdom. But my friend, Brian Malone, suggested instead that actually you can trade across leagues. If I want to trade, or let's take two guys who are valued pretty similarly, Lamar Jackson and Jaden Daniels, right? Let's say I have Jaden Daniels and I want to get Lamar Jackson. I try to trade Jaden Daniels for Lamar Jackson, and whoever has Jackson in the league, I have Daniels. He's not biting. He likes Jackson. He wants to stick with Jackson. Okay, that's fair enough. Instead, I could find another player who's valued about the same as both Jackson and Daniels, and I could trade Daniels for I don't even know who'd be. Let's say Brock Bowers, because that's who we're talking about. I trade Daniels for Brock Bowers in that league, and in another league, I trade Brock Bowers for Lamar Jackson, right? Some people would say, well, you didn't really trade Daniels for Jackson in that case. But if you look at all my teams together, my teams are all exactly the same, except I have one fewer Jaden Daniels and one more Lamar Jackson than I did at the start of the process, right? I gained a Bowers and I lost a Bowers, and that all offsets. And so the net result is that I now have a little bit more exposure to Jackson and a little bit less exposure to Daniels. If Jackson continues having a monster year, my entire portfolio of teams will benefit from that, right? If Jackson falls off a cliff, or if Daniels winds up going on to be the greatest quarterback in NFL history, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but who knows? There's a wide range of possibilities. Then my entire portfolio of teams will suffer in that instance. The entire outcome across all of my leagues, provided that I'm maintaining some sort of balance on my team. I'm not acquiring 15 quarterbacks in one league by trading away all my running backs in another league, as long as I'm keeping my rosters fairly balanced and I'm not overloading at age or youth or whatever. The net result is that a good outcome will be just as beneficial across my entire portfolio as if I'd made that trade in a single league. And looking at things this way, it makes it a lot easier to do deals because you don't just have one potential trade partner for a player. Now, if you're in 20 leagues, there's 20 potential trade partners. I can find the league where Lamar Jackson is the cheapest and buy him there. I can find the league where Jaden Daniels is the most expensive and I can sell him there. And I can make, it really opens up the possibility of, so I talk about going Daniels to Bowers and Bowers to Jackson. But what if I find a league where everybody's really big fans of Jaden Daniels and I can get Daniels for Bowers in a second, and then I can trade Bowers for Jackson in a second? I still did that whole Daniels to Jackson move, but I picked up 2 free second round rookie picks in the process, you know. Or I could even do something like trade Daniels for Jackson in a second in one league and trade Jackson for Daniels in a second in another league. And my portfolio remains exactly the same. I haven't changed anything except I just picked up 2 free rookie picks in the process. I have just as much exposure to good and bad outcomes as I did before, except now I've got that extra draft capital. And so it kind of takes a little bit to get your head around looking at teams that way, where these are not discrete entities. They're just, one aspect of my overall larger team that encompasses my entire dynasty portfolio. But when you do that, I think that's probably the easiest way to make risk-free trades and gain risk-free value in dynasty. And I don't really say risk-free lightly, because dynasty is largely a game of evaluating risk. But I think especially in the case of like the Daniels for Jackson in a second and Jackson for Daniels in a second, there really is no risk to something like that, because you're not any more or less likely to win championships in the short term. You're just getting free value.
Yeah, I like this approach, and I kind of naturally already do it because there's just players I like more or differently than other people because of the way I evaluate. So I find that these players gravitate towards me in rookie drafts or when I'm rebuilding, because I see them as values differently than other people see them as values. And I wind up with teams where, I would say every dynasty team I had probably had Travis Kelce, Nick Chubb, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, and there are probably, Amari Cooper and Stephon Diggs, and I'm trying to think of Adam Thielen was one of those guys at some point. There was just like a base of like 6 to 8 guys that were almost on every dynasty team that I've had, because they were values that I could get, and I valued them differently than other people. And I know that the way a lot of people play is differently than that, because they're playing, let me diversify my portfolio, and that way. But to me, that's one way to guarantee that or not guarantee, but to increase your chances if you play in enough leagues that something's going to be successful. But I would argue that the way to really play dynasty is, and I think you're smiling because you're the same way as me, which is
no, I was about to say, I think I'm going to disagree.
Oh, you're going to disagree, but I think I like playing dynasty where you're like, I'm all in on certain players, and I'm going to roll with these guys and see how it works. I understand the skill set of diversifying your portfolio, but there's a part of me that just loves the idea, like, no, I'm going to win big. I'm going to go for it, so.
Yeah, I mean, I hate managing lots of different teams. And I wrote, too, in the article that, like, you can use this mindset even if you only have one team. You can just pretend that you have another, make a plus market value trade, and then just pretend that you have imaginary teams that you're making the counter trade on. But I don't really like managing lots of different teams. I do like having that specific connection to each individual team and kind of that emotional investment. But my ideal would be to just have like every player in the NFL on my teams somewhere, and have more shares of the guys I really like and fewer shares of the guys that I don't like. But then like every big play, I'm like, yes, that's awesome. I'm so excited for that. Like, I want to be invested in every single player, not just as to like mitigate risk or whatever, but just because I love football. I love the players, I appreciate like the sacrifices that they're making. And I just want to be invested in the players and their journeys. And I want to have a stake in as much as possible. So yeah, that's me. Like, I'm not going to load up on the same guys. I'm going to actively try to get a piece of everybody. And
that's true.
I just want to be rooting for
thinking about how you've talked about this in every week that we've done shows. I've noticed that's true. I've noticed that. I don't know why I was thinking otherwise. I think that for one, I will say I enjoy having some teams that are very different. Like, I have a team right now that I just blew up. Like, I traded away Chris Godwin a couple weeks ago TJ Watt, Fred Warner, a bunch of like, I had like a dominant defense and no offense, and I won the league last year. And this year, it just didn't really come together on offense in time. So I've just blew up the team and collected picks. And it's been kind of fun to do that. I haven't done that in probably about 12 to 15 years. So I'm kind of enjoying where that's going. It's just so I can understand that, and I can appreciate your point of view and your theme of, I just want to enjoy watching football and be invested in somebody from in every game, and I can get with that. I think that if you're doing it from that perspective, I love that. For me, it's kind of more like, I don't want to have to keep up with every little thing, and then there's just some that I just really like more than others. So, and I can watch any game and enjoy it, so I don't really have to be invested in a player. But I get that point of view. I want to end this with talking about a dynasty area that I think is important, especially from a film watcher standpoint. And I wrote an article on Anthony Richardson in this week's Gut Check where, I said, enjoy the panic on Anthony Richardson. And the reason that I titled it as such is that, I had people ask, so are you going to talk about Richardson and how he's doing? Because he doesn't look like he's doing well. And there's some mass media concern about him and that he's not developing in a way that we'd like to see. And, we're not, we're 2 years in. Well, we're actually 9 games in. We're not 2 years in. We're 9 years in. 9 games in. So I looked at the 8 to 9 games, similar type of snaps within about 100 snaps of 3 other players. And I'm not going to give it away, but they have 3 MVPs between them. One took a team to a Super Bowl. They all have similar profiles in terms of that they were either big guys who could run, and you'll probably already know who some of these guys is as I share it, but big guys who can run, or people that were pretty very, very good in the pocket, but could also move outside the pocket and were big play options. And one of them's Lamar Jackson. That I'll just keep that one in there. And when you look at those 9 games from a standpoint of touchdowns, touchdown rate, interception rate, breaking out passing and rushing touchdowns rate, completion percentage, yards per attempt, all the different types of data like that, it was all very similar, and I had before I did that, I looked at the film and I'm watching him play and I'm like, there's nothing there that gives me significant concern about his development. Are there things he has to work on and improve upon? Absolutely. Did he get blitzed more than Joe Flacco in the games that he was in? For sure. A lot more often. I would say the types of plays that they're running aren't amazingly different. Some people are saying Richardson's going downfield more and Burrow maybe they should do more RPOs, but Richardson's a big play kind of aggressive thrower downfield, and he's been hit or miss with some of those plays. But what I am seeing are things like zeroing in and out. I wasn't going to say it, but like I will. Like I was watching a Dan Orlovsky video, and Dan was talking about footwork. And Dan obviously understands the quarterback position, but there's a difference between scouting a quarterback and playing quarterback in the league. And I would also argue that Dan's point of view isn't great from a scouting standpoint. He hasn't spent a lot of time from a standpoint developing a process and looking at how you scout. He just watches the film, and so there's really no prioritization of value on what can develop and what won't develop. And you see that a lot with quarterbacks out there. And you also have to look at their frame of reference. He was a backup quarterback. He wasn't a starter. So he's not giving you the point of view necessarily of what it means for a starter to improve while he's being a starter, and how hard that is, and what priorities given to things like footwork, and different mechanics, and whether you're going to learn and develop that while you're focused on game plan and executing that game plan each week, as opposed to being on the bench for years at a time. And you get a chance to work on that because your priority isn't whether or not you're going to be playing that week or dealing with injury and having to rehab all of that. And I think so that his frame of reference is a little bit flawed at times, and he approaches it from his backup frame of reference in the league, as opposed to what it means to be a starter and what the prioritization of things are. And I also think there's a bit of the big name media thing of like, we need to entertain. And how do you entertain? Then create a little bit of drama. So if you're going to talk about a player's footwork and say, this is why he wasn't accurate, I mean, I went and looked at some of the tape and I thought the reason he missed the throws that I saw weren't because he was bouncing up and down a little bit in and out of his drop. Those aren't, and it's funny because I asked his coach too, just to confirm. I said, this seems kind of like a little alarmist to me in terms of the point of view. And he was like, yeah. He said, he corroborated with me this kind of similar things. And it's and I think that we just need to understand that sometimes that film watchers, they watch the film and talk about what a good technique is, and they see the trees, but they don't see the forest through the trees very well. And so what can happen is that they haven't studied what skills actually are easier to correct over time and have less impact on development, and what have more impact on development. And I would argue that, with a guy like Anthony Richardson, the footwork and the timeline that Dan probably expects over that to be developed is inaccurate. If you watch Jameis Winston or Josh Allen or some of these other guys, they didn't have the refined feet early on in their career. Lamar Jackson didn't have the refined feet early in his career. I would argue a guy like Cam Newton didn't have the refined feet in his career in terms of drop back setups and throwing. And they developed into productive quarterbacks, and the stats bore out that way. And I think with Richardson, if you're harping on those things, you're harping on the wrong things. The things that I'd be more worried about with Richardson is he not seeing the coverage well, and it's the types of coverages that he saw in college and had success with. Is that clouding the picture? Is he not making good decisions in situational football, red zone, black zone, third down? Is he not, is he making reckless plays as a thrower that he shouldn't be doing, not based on confusion of what a disguise has shown him, but something that's straightforward? And I'd say that guys like Pickett and Trubisky and Paxton Lynch and Drew Lock to an extent, a lot of those guys who were first rounders, Desmond Ridder, were having those issues in their career. I would say from what I've seen from Anthony Richardson is he's missed throws. He's been inaccurate at times, but they weren't due to a poor decision. It was more of him trying to do something physically that he was capable of doing at Florida that might not quite work at Indianapolis, and he's trying to learn his limits. And it was the same thing Matthew Stafford went through early in his career. So I think part of it is learning what's the big picture and what's the small picture, and not blowing the small picture out of proportion. And I would say that what we'll see with Anthony Richardson right now is a lot of the small picture being blown out of proportion, just like we saw with Lamar Jackson. And so my advice to people is buy Anthony Richardson right now, if you can. The only problem that I would say is that if you're in a decent league, the same people who bought Lamar Jackson or even or a player who developed like that, maybe even Jalen Hurts, are probably the same people who are going to value Anthony Richardson and will probably stay patient. So you may not get a deal from that subset, You're not going to get a deal from that subset. But the people.
Well, but if that's the case, you can just trade across leagues.
There you go.
If you're in one league where that's not the case, and one league where it is, just trade across leagues.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm still bullish on Anthony Richardson, and the fact that I could write an article. It was probably the easiest article I've written in about the past 10 years, to be honest. Because I was like, I watched the film and I'm not going to share one lick of it. It's because it doesn't matter in this case. In terms of making the argument, all it's going to do is have people who don't understand how to prioritize what matters in development of the position and what doesn't, getting, blowing things out of proportion. Because if I tell you, the footwork's not that big of a deal, then they're going, well, what about the release here? And what about the fact that he didn't place it there? And then it starts to go down this rabbit hole of things that you're like, you're just neurotically chasing things that are eventually going to work themselves out, in the sense of that we've seen him have sharper play. Like I've seen sharp play from him with footwork and with different things at Florida. And the footwork anyway, for people that they need to understand, is it's like the feet show you what the eyes see and how the mind is processing. So it's only natural that if something's confusing you, or if you're not sharp, your footwork's not going to be sharp. I've seen that happen in games with players who have been known to have great footwork. So, if you watch the feet, you understand whether the mind is late to process something or whether it's unsure, and all of that kind of thing. And so you got to look at a broader spectrum of tape than just isolate a couple of plays.
Yeah, and zooming out, I think one of the big problems with how people view the NFL, and kind of analyze basically everything, is that they believe we live in a much more deterministic universe than we actually live in.
Right.
They think that things follow a pattern and things go in an orderly progression. I mean, I remember, 12 years ago, I was getting in arguments about the dynasty value of Mike Wallace versus Vincent Jackson. And the argument for Wallace is that, you're 2-3 years in and he's producing like Vincent Jackson and he's still in the early stages of his career. He's only going to go up from here. And I'm like, that's not the case. Production is loosely correlated with skill as a player, but it's not. People think careers are curves, and they're not. They think that you start at this low point and ascend to your peak and then descend down. Anquan Bolden set his career yardage high in his first season, never matched that again. Cam Newton, his first career game wound up being the second highest passing total of his entire career. His second career game was his first highest passing total of his entire career. His first 2 games were the 2 highest passing yardage games. And he went on to win an MVP later on. Careers are not.
Yeah, but his pass percentage his first year, or his first, was like higher than the rest of his career. Like he actually plateaued, like completion percentage wise, early in his career.
But I mean, watching him on film, you would not say that was the best he played the position, right?
No.
Like he was not a better passer as a rookie than he was. Or you look at Derrick Henry.
Yeah.
Derrick Henry, you look at him, you look at his career stats and like, oh yeah, he when he was 25 and 26, he was over 5 yards per carry. He was over 100 yards per game. His yards per game has been trending down the last 3 years. His yards per carry has been trending down. He's down to 4.2. And because careers are orderly curves, now he's a year older. He's going to be a year worse. He's going to average fewer yards per carry and fewer yards per game. And he's just going to continue dwindling until eventually he reaches replacement level and he washes out of the NFL. And that's not what happens. If you look at the top 50 wide receivers, fantasy wide receivers of the last 30 to 50 years, about half of them were better in their last relevant season than they were in their second to last relevant season. Like career, basically random walks. There's a lot of reasons why a player's production might be up or down that have nothing to do with the player's craft and skill as a player. It's just there's so much extraneous outside stuff that if you're looking at somebody like Richardson, and you're saying like, okay, this is what I want the curve to look like, and he's not conforming to that curve. So therefore, he's not going to get to where I expected him to get to.
I'm worried. Yeah.
I'm creating a new curve. I'm changing
Yeah.
the curve that I now expect him to follow. Now he's going to follow this different, worse curve. That's not how NFL careers work. That's not. It's just not. So many players. I mean, I could give you like Drew Hill with the Houston Oilers, had like 1,000 receiving yards through his age 29 season, and then joined the Oilers, and then went on to be one of the most productive wide receivers in the NFL. There's just so many examples of that. Yeah, so many examples.
Yeah.
I mean, we could probably spend the next 5 hours just saying
Naming
random
people.
names, right? Like the classic of the genre, dudes just saying random football players' names.
I feel like I could see us in Vegas getting drunk, like well, maybe not, but like I could see the joke of us in Vegas getting drunk, just naming random players like for like a 5-hour period and laughing about it, you know. So that's how it would work.
Yeah, people think, and it's not just NFL. People think that life is deterministic. You know, there's the just world fallacy, which is that people get what they deserve, and to some extent, we need to have this fallacy to rationalize living in a world that is, quite frankly, capricious and unfair. And in order, we need that sense of meaning making, but that doesn't make it true. And in the NFL, careers are weird. They're random. They're unpredictable. The numbers go in weird and unprecedented directions all the time, and that's normal. That's just what life and football looks like.
I would joke that if my career were that of a quarterback and starting at like 18, I was probably like a 3-star prospect who wound up, who my family expected me to like be like an early round draft pick and be an early round draft pick. But then I did nothing for about 15 years and they just wrote me off. And then suddenly things changed. And it was like, because they had that expectation of that curve. We have that in our lives where people like, some people, when your family comes from that baby boomer track of like, this is how the world works, and they don't realize that worked for them and that was their track, but your track is different.
Although I question even how much it worked for them. I mean, even in their day,
exactly.
It wasn't. I get this from young people all the time that like, this is the path I want to be on. Like, I expect to be here at this point, and I'm not there, and therefore I feel like a failure. And that's what I say all the time. Life is not an orderly progression. It's just not.
Take everything that you've learned, and you're gonna apply everything you learn. You just have to be open and willing to do it, and experience it, and not get down on yourself. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's cool. I mean, I don't believe in like where I should be. I am where I am. Everybody is where they are. You can make choices about what you're going to do about that at the moment, but there's no sense comparing to counterfactual universes. That way lies madness. And I think, like old guys like you and me, you more than me, but old guys like us, who especially
it'll
guys
all come out in the wash in 15 years. It's going to be relative at that point,
Absolutely, yeah. Hey, percentage-wise, I'm getting closer to you every single day.
Exactly.
But especially guys who've gone through non-linear life paths, I think we have an easier time seeing that. And I'm not saying that it's never an orderly progression. One of the things that's always blown my mind about my wife is, she decided in high school what she wanted to be, and she never changed her mind through college, and she never changed her mind as a professional, and her life has been basically exactly what she decided it would be as like a 15, 16-year-old kid in high school. But she's the one who like ruins it for all of us, because then everybody's like, well, look, she did it. Why can't you do it too? And she's the outlier. I'm not the outlier. Yeah. She's the outlier.
I think it looked like my life was going to be this track that was just like laid out in front of me. Like, and at 18, it was laid out in front, and I just took some dynamite and blew that the fuck up. And like decided, I don't know what I want to do, but I'm going to explore what I want to explore. And it was funny because, I'm 54 years old, and my 79-year-old father, like, I went and visited him, and he just looked at me and just was kind of like, like I said, he goes, everything you did, which was like very different stuff. He said, you used all of that to what you do now. And like, just, because he was an optometrist. So he went to school, he did that, he opened a practice, and anything that he did different was still in the realm of being an optometrist. So that was his life in terms of his work career. And mine was like all over the place in different ways. And it was always kind of odd to him. I remember, like, while I was working as a journalist, he was like, you don't even have like a degree with that. And I'm like, you don't need a degree for that stuff. There's a lot of things you don't need a degree for with that. You just need to develop skill and create opportunity and do the work and learn, but it's funny how people do that. But I remember being in my early 20s, and like you said, looking at the world ahead and going, struggling with the idea of where I'm supposed to be, what I want to do, and I wish it was this easy track, and looking at people like your wife and going, I wish I could have that. I wish I could have that. And now I'm glad I'd never had that. But you have to learn. I think the most important thing is you've got to learn to be comfortable with your own skin, within your own skin, and realize the value that you do have and what you can create, and be okay with certain risks, and know that life isn't going to be over for you if you fail, and that failing is probably one of the most important things that you do, and do it repeatedly, as long as it's not the type of failure that is life and death failure, that is one that you can account for as many of the risks as possible and go, okay, I can live with this if this doesn't work out. Even though I'm going to feel like I want to die when it happens, you'll realize that I've survived that, and that aids you moving forward.
Yeah, and bringing it back to fantasy too. Anytime you have a chance to bet on a random and chaotic and non-deterministic universe, like, that's where the profit is. Everybody is expecting these orderly curves. There's no profit to be made there. You're grinding for pennies. The real value is recognizing that life is capricious and arbitrary, and unfair, and the path that people take is not going to be the path that you expect them to take, and being open to those possibilities.
Yeah, and Anthony Richardson, when you look at his physical abilities, they are unfair. And I would rather bet on somebody who's going to eventually figure out how unfair they actually are, and kind of get used to that. And that path to do that is going to be different than someone like Tom Brady, who was steady work from the beginning to rise from the bottom to the top, which was also unlikely in many respects. But it's the path that people think about, is you apply yourself the great American way, just do the work and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and it'll just be this steady progression. Whereas I think with somebody who's unbelievably talented, you see them zigzagging in a lot of different ways until they go, okay, I've felt out the boundaries. Now I know what I can and can't do. Let's get to work. So with that,
there's the parable about bamboo, where, like, if you watch a bamboo tree grow, for like months and months and months, there's absolutely nothing at all, no change whatsoever, and then it shoots up like 30 feet in 30 days, where it's just that all that period before where nothing was happening, a lot of stuff was happening. It was just happening below the surface where you couldn't see it, and it was laying the groundwork so that when that explosive growth came, there was that base to support it. And I think that's much more common. The other stuff happens. The steady linear growth happens just often enough to fool people into thinking that it happens all the time. But that's really the exception rather than the rule.
No, I love that, and that's a great ending point for us. Probably my favorite thing that I learned today. Again, catch Adam Harstad at Adam Harstad on X, of course, at Football Guys, Dynasty Theory. He also gives you, your kicker needs, regression alert, all very good and helpful content. Find me at mattwaldmanrsp.com, as well as at Matt Waldman on X, and of course the Gut Check Top 10 roundtables coming out today with staff Wayne, and I'm trying to ask them some questions to make them think a little bit, and we have a good time doing it. So thanks again, folks, and we will see you next week.